this video, we're going to take a comparison look at the 3 paint modes you can choose from anytime you are merging from the retopo room here to the paint room. It's also the same 3 that you can choose from anytime you want to import a model directly into the paint room itself. We want to first change the shader. Now, you don't have to do this, or you don't have to take this step, but what I prefer typically is to try and use a shader that has the color and the specularity level that I want to start with in the paint room. Now, these shaders are not applied to the low polygon object or the mesh in the paint room that we're going to be working on. They are just usable on voxel objects themselves. But nevertheless, we can use this information during the baking process. So what I'm going to do is choose the body layer here in the Vox Tree layer panel and apply a shader to it. I think this blue one will work. And I want a slightly different color, so what I can do is right click and choose Edit Current Object Shader Settings and change the color a little bit. And let's go ahead and do the same thing for the tongue, teeth, and the eyes. Alright, so we're all set. I'm going to go to the retopo menu, and we're going to start with per pixel painting mode. And as you can see, you have the 2 other modes here as well. We have a few options though for each mode. The first one here has this abbreviation of NM standing for normal maps. So it's going to merge into the paint room in per pixel paint mode, and it's going to bake a normal map. If you notice, if we come down here, there is no mention of a normal map. That means 3D Coat is not going to bake any kind of displacement. No, it's not going to bake any color or specularity. It's simply going to send a copy of this mesh or meshes to the paint room and provide us some blank paint layers to start with. So really it's just a no frills option. Okay, the third option here we will explore shortly, and it gives you some flexibility to work with both a normal map and a displacement map. But let's go ahead and click on this first option. In the previous video, we went over this dialog in some detail, so we will click OK. And then the next dialog we see is an option to check or uncheck Bake Local Occlusion at this stage in the process. So let's go ahead and click OK. And this first option here for initial subdivision is no subdivision at all, and it's just going to send this low poly version into the paint room. However, no matter which subdivision level you choose, you will still be given the option upon export to choose a non-subdivided version or the one you choose. So if I choose this second option here, this is what I'll get in the viewport in the paint room, and it will allow me to work with some displacement if I want. But I'm not locked into this particular subdivision level. I can always export a non-subdivided version if I want. If I did not have any of these set up, at this point I could use auto mapping, and I just typically use no smoothing. I can set the size of the texture maps here per UV map. I hit OK. And by the way, I should mention that in the retopo menu I chose use name correspondence for baking. It's going through and baking the body, then the eyes, and the teeth and tongue separately. Okay, it looks like we're finished here, and we can go to the paint room, and you can see the voxel object is taking up the same space as our new lower polygon baked version. So let's go to the Vox Tree layer panel on the root layer. I'm going to click on the visibility icon to hide that. And I'm going to try and add a spec color layer to this so we can see a bit better when we apply a little bit of normal map detail. So I'll create a new layer here, double click, name it body underscore spec color. And I want to enable just color and specularity as the name implies. 3D Coat is going to use this color to tint the specularity. So I need both, but make sure you don't have depth enabled, because when you do, if at some point you want to check show displaced mesh, what's going to happen is if you fill this layer with depth. You might not necessarily see anything at this point, okay, but once you show that displaced mesh, you actually applied some displacement by having that enabled. So we don't want that. The next thing I want to do is hide these other elements that I don't want spec color applied, or at least not this spec color applied. So I'll go back to the paint layer panel, and yeah, I could use a fill tool, but in this case I'll just uncheck ignore back faces so I can go all the way through. Use a freeform lasso. Yeah, uncheck depth. We're ready to rock and roll. Just going to go ahead and drag select. And now what I want to do is change the blending mode to spec color. In the blending panel, okay, I can adjust the specularity down. I can use the slider here. There we go. Let me change it to 0.35. And I should have pointed out that you want to be careful with your specularity value before you make that selection, before you use the fill tool, because it's not based on the color, it's based on the value right here. And again, you can always step up or step down a little bit with the modulator, but obviously having it right the first time prevents you from having to do a lot of adjustment here. Okay, and I think we're ready to unhide these other elements, maybe. I'm going to go ahead and hide the eye. I'm going to create a new layer and name this, let's say, body depth 02. Now, you don't have to isolate layers for individual operations like this. I could stay on this body layer and just continue adding normal map detail, color detail, specularity, because you have 3 channels for every layer. So, with that said, let me zoom in a bit. And I'm going to go back up to my depth layer. Yeah, with that done, let's go to a stamp. And let me see if I can find something here. Like this. And for demonstration purposes, I can crank my depth up a bit, but I don't normally, on small wrinkles and things like that, I don't want to go up too high, but I want to show the ability to see displacement in the viewport. And got to make sure, again, that I check the right channel before I start working. So I'm going to do that. I've got symmetry enabled, but you can turn that off if you like. Alright, so let me now bring up the texture editor from the textures menu. You can assign a hotkey to it if you like, that way you can quickly bring it up at any time. You can opt to dock it all the way to the left, and that way you've got your 2D editor on one side and your 3D viewport on the other, with all your tools right in between. But I typically like to work with it here just inside this right column, so that when I'm working, I'm just right here by all the layers and also all the different options, the tool options, the brush options, and so on. Okay. So as you can see, when you click on the wireframe, you'll see this original state of the mesh, the retopology state. And this is very much like having a subdivision modifier applied to your original mesh in your host application. And when you enable that subdivision modifier, when you crank up the subdivision levels, you have the option to see the wireframe of the subdivision levels or of the original state. And that's essentially what you have here in 3D Coat. So 3D Coat is storing this original state in memory, so that when you export, you have the option to export this original state or the subdivided state. Okay, so let me now switch to the normal map. If I zoom in, you can see that now that we're in per pixel painting mode, you've got a normal map as opposed to a displacement map that you have in Micro Vertex or PTEX. Okay, but again, recently Andrew enabled the ability to have normal displacement, not just this camera trick. As you can see from a frontal view, it looks like there is some protrusion on these bumps, but when you go to a side view, there's nothing, not even the slightest amount. Okay, and that's because normal maps, just like bump maps, are an illusion or camera trick. Right? And it's kind of always been their limitation. Whereas displacement maps will actually, move a subdivided mesh based on all the different color values of the map. So now, if I choose Show Displaced Mesh, you can see how much different that is. Now let me hit the W key to toggle wireframe on, and this is why it's important to have some level of subdivision here in the viewport so that you can see it if this is indeed what you want. If you want to work in per pixel painting with some level of displacement, or have the flexibility to work with displacement, then you certainly want to keep this in mind. Let me point one other thing out that you might find interesting. Again, in your host application, you have a low polygon version, and if you apply a subdivision modifier on top of that, you'll see this low poly cage, and yet the result of the subdivision beneath that. And that's what you have here when you adjust subpatching. So per UV map, you can go in and change this value. Let me scrub to bring it down to 0, hit OK, and you'll notice a difference in the quality of the actual displacement. Now you want to be careful because again, this is already subdivided twice. So you want to make sure that your hardware can handle it. But let's change it to 3, hit OK. And it has more geometry actually to help displace this correctly. And the real beauty about that in 3D Coat is you can always adjust your depth down if you need. Let me change that subpatching back to 0. Back to 2 maybe. So that just kind of reset it essentially. But we'll leave it at 2. And I want to point out that you can not only adjust the level globally on that layer, but also locally. So let me adjust the depth back up. Oops. You can even go over 100% if you need. So if we go to the magnification brush here and choose reduction, it's going to reduce the displacement value. Okay, so choose a regular brush. Now you can see it reduce. This is a good way to kind of fade in certain details, and you can add another layer for bump and do the same. Just blend them in like this and adjust the depth value. And you can also always go in and mask a part as well. So let me quickly demonstrate that. Create a new layer. I'm going to name it mask. I need to go back to the layer that I want to affect, or I want to apply a mask to. In the blending panel, at the very bottom, I'll find mask. And just as in Photoshop, whenever you create a selection, and then at the bottom of the paint layer panel, you click on the create layer mask icon, it's going to mask out everything. Alright, so in this case, you can simply just invert the mask, invert the linkage here. So now, when I choose the mask layer, I want to enable just color. I don't want to be applying any of these, just color. All right, go back to the paintbrush. Make sure I have the right brush alpha chosen. And you're going to see some paint. That's all right, because this is your mask. But if you don't want to see that paint, just adjust the opacity, and you can see it just masks that out. So again, you can always start off by reducing the opacity all the way down, and as you're brushing out all that detail. Or you could choose the eraser and just, oops, yeah, and erase the mask. So it's very cool. Alright, so what are the major benefits of per pixel painting as opposed to micro vertex? Well, as you can see here, not only do we have a normal map that we're working with, and if you're working on a game model, that's probably what you want. But micro vertex, essentially, as the name implies, you're painting on the vertices of the model. And when you export, 3D Coat basically collapses all the individual layers, and it bakes all that color, specularity, and depth information down to an image map. Right? But during the baking process, there's a possibility that you can lose image data. With per pixel painting, you are literally painting on the image map itself. So there is no baking process involved at all that could degrade the quality of your paint detail. In simple terms, what you see is what you get. The other thing I want to point out is, as far as an advantage of per pixel painting, is that it works better with non-quad faces. And it's not dependent on how many faces you have. So you can have an extremely low polygon model, and as long as you have enough resolution on your texture map, you can get extreme amount of resolution or extreme amount of detail. It's not contingent upon the polygon count. You also happen to have the side benefit of better performance because it's directly painting on the map itself, and it's kind of a no-nonsense method. So the paint quality does not depend on the distance of the object to the camera. That means micro vertex, you have to be kind of careful if you're trying to paint a lot of detail. A lot of it is relative to how close your model is. So with per pixel painting, it doesn't matter. And I also find in my own personal experience that whenever you go through the baking process, per pixel painting tends to be the least problematic. It tends to be the easiest to get a good result. And oftentimes you get a good result the first time. And even if it's not perfect, it usually is good enough to quickly go in and fix any little small issues within just a matter of seconds or a few minutes. So it's really not much of an issue. Whereas in micro vertex, because it's having to subdivide and displace during the whole baking process, then in certain areas where you have a lot of polygons in a very small space, then you could have some issues, maybe like the corner of the lips, the corner of the eyes, in between fingers, and so on. Okay, we'll stop right here and pick up in the next video covering that third option, where you can merge for per pixel painting with displacement, and then we'll also look at micro vertex as well. So stay tuned.